So to begin and give a bit of background, the aim of this qualitative study was to explore the influence of food supply channels on household food practices. And a part of our study in Ireland focused on alternative food networks, and in particular involved a case study of a community supported agriculture, or CSA. So in general, alternative food networks, as you can see on the slide, strive to produce and distribute local, organic and artisan foods through close connections between producers and consumers in a more socially and environmentally friendly manner. And CSAs are a distinct form of alternative food network in that the producers and consumers share to varying extents the risks, rewards and responsibilities associated with food production. So moving on to the methodology, the study adopted a social practice ontology in order to explore the nuanced daily routines and practices in the household in order to better understand household food practices. A mixed method approach was used, whereby in-depth interviews, non-participant observations and food diaries were used. There was a sample of 10 CSA members interviewed as part of the study, and each interviewee was the main person responsible for food acquisition in their respective household. The CSA in this case study has been in operation since the year 2000 and grew from an intentional eco-village, which is beside a small rural village in Ireland. So the majority of the sample, 7 of the members, were residents of the eco-village, while 3 were CSA members but not living in the eco-village itself. We then carried out a thematic analysis of the data collected in relation to 5 food practices, which are acquiring, storing, cooking, eating and disposing, and each of these practices was explored in relation to the 3 levels of practices that were asserted by Shove et al. In 2012 in meanings, materials and skills. So the core findings of the study that emerged were the fact that CSA members' food practices are significantly influenced by varying availability of seasonal produce throughout the year. So in an effort to maintain a balanced and nutritious diet throughout the year and the different seasons of the year, and also in order to minimise and prevent food waste, the CSA members evidently adjusted their practices based on the time of the year. So examples of such practices were cooking practices such as making pestos and soups in order to make the best possible use out of produce that was seasonally abundant or available in gluts, as was described. So foods such as potatoes or kale, for example, often had this rich abundance at given times of the year, and pestos and soups were evidenced as a way to avoid food waste and to make the best use of these seasonal produce. Other practices such as preservation practices in pickling vegetables, drying herbs and freezing fruits was also a method evidenced in extending the lifespan of seasonal produce. And with fruits, for example, the idea of being able to freeze fruits now when they're available from the farm in order to use them later on in the year when they're no longer seasonally available. So the positive impact of the CSA on the food practices of its members can be explained in part by the social and the cultural characteristics of the CSA and the eco-village. And 5 points emerged in particular in this regard. So the first is in relation to empowerment and how the CSA members are not just customers of the CSA, but they are active members and they are involved and committed to not only getting food from the CSA but also have an input in the decision making in what food is produced, how it is produced and when it is produced, for example. The second point is the idea of community and how a culture of solidarity within the CSA was evidenced in the interviews, and how many of the interviewees spoke about the idea of co-learning from other people that were members of the CSA, and the community meals that they shared, during which they could speak about different recipes. This overlaps with the third point, which is that of cooking skills, and how a few of the interviewees mentioned how they have learned how to cook foods that they before now would have been unfamiliar with, due to conversations had in the CSA collection point. So they might chat about different recipes or even some of the preservation techniques mentioned on one of the previous slides. The fourth point is in social connection, and how the members not only had this social connection with each other, but also with the farmer and the volunteers, and how some of them mentioned that they occasionally go to the farm in order to speak to the farmer and the volunteers, and this dynamic adds a social element and a social connection and meaning behind the food itself. The final point then is proximity and physical proximity, in that the CSA members all live in a rural area and therefore have less mainstream provisioning options, and as a result they expressed a closer connection to the place where their food was produced. So in relation to conclusions and implications, we concluded that seasonal and seasonally adjusted food practices are necessary for CSA members, as they have chosen the CSA as their primary or their core food supply channel. However, this is not the case for the majority of consumers in Ireland, as the majority of consumers may not be in a position to either join a CSA or live in an eco-village. So the main points that we would like to highlight for the conclusions are how interventions in the mainstream could be designed in order to both promote and enable sustainable food consumption practices that were evidenced in this study at both a household level and throughout the supply chain. So we found that CSA members can set an example to mainstream consumers in several ways and on two different levels. So while mainstream consumers might not be able to join a CSA or indeed live in an eco-village, they could perhaps learn from the example set by CSA members and make gradual small steps to more sustainable consumption practices. So on a practical level, the CSA members evidently adjust their day-to-day practices through social learning, so by learning from each other, which could have important implications for enabling and promoting more sustainable food consumption practices in the mainstream. And on a higher level, they also adopt sustainability meanings into their lifestyles, and a significant influence here is that of the social norms that are evident within the CSA itself, and the manner in which the members change their food practices, but also how they view food and the meanings around food as a result. And potential mainstream interventions that could potentially be beneficial as a result include communications to mainstream consumers in order to increase awareness about local and seasonal foods. Furthermore, mechanisms that foster co-learning and the kind of social connections that were evidenced in the CSA could also be beneficial. And this follows into the third point, which is the value of striving to further improve culinary skills. And finally, highlighting the beneficial role of equipment such as food processors, freezers and reusable containers, which can enable these food practices. So to conclude, I would like to thank the CSA members for their participation in this study, and the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine for funding this project.